Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Happy to welcome Sim Tack, the chief military analyst at Force Analysis, back onto the podcast. Sim's episodes are always among the most downloaded and most shared episodes that we have, and that's because Sim offers extremely rigorous and extremely good analysis of what is happening with the Russia-Ukraine war tactically, but also in general with security conflicts around the world. And we delve into some of that in our conversation as well. So thank you, Sim, for making time out of your busy squash schedule to come on the podcast. I appreciate it. Listeners, if you haven't left a rating or a review of the podcast and you like the podcast, please consider doing so. We have a lot more listeners at this time last year, right now, this year, than we did at this time last year. So if you haven't done that, take a few seconds out of your day and do that for us. It really helps us, and it just takes you a few seconds of your time. Otherwise, you can write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have questions about the CI Research Knowledge Platform, which we rolled out, which Rob and I talked about last week. You might want to get in touch about that. If you want to talk about our wealth management services, or if you just want to tell me, interesting things about what you think about the world, all of those things are fair game. I enjoy corresponding with all of you that write in. So without further ado, cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, Sim, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for making some time to be with us. I wish we were playing squash and having this conversation, but alas, the best we can do is look at each other through screens and talking to microphones. How's it going, my friend?
Everything's well. Thanks, Jacob. Thanks for having me again.
Sim, where is the vaunted Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023? We're recording on May 17th. It's a Wednesday. This will come out on Monday. Will the offensive have begun by the time this podcast posts? Has the offensive already begun in a sneaky way that I'm discounting? Do you believe Zelensky when he said, I forget if it was earlier this week or last week, where he was like, well, we don't have enough weapons quite yet, so maybe if you want this counteroffensive, we need some more weapons. It seems to me like there's been a lot of buildup towards a counteroffensive, and it's not there yet. And it's getting late enough in the year to where, okay, like, it's summer now, like winter's not that far away. Take that question in whatever direction you want.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. A lot of the things you said, like, they're all different things that are happening simultaneously and affecting the way that this offensive comes together. So first off, I think in the conventional sense of what people are expecting to see in this offensive, we're not seeing that yet, right? We're not seeing the big pushes. We actually have quite a bit of information on how Ukraine is putting this offensive together in terms of units contributed to it through the leaks that came out some time ago. And that's also telling us that those units that will make up the main offensive force are not yet on the front lines. So we can kind of say in a very binary sense, like, no, the offensive isn't happening yet. But at the same time, and as I told someone recently as well, the offensive is both happening and not happening, right? Because there's different phases to this kind of an offensive. So that the tanks rolling across the line, that's not happening yet, but that's just one part. Actually, probably more like a part near the end of the offensive process, where initially there's going to be a lot of preparation in terms of intelligence gathering, preparation of the battlefield, shaping the battlefield through, preparatory artillery fires, deep strikes. And I think those are the kind of things that we're already starting to see, especially with the arrival of the Storm Shadow, which has expanded Ukraine's reach for those kind of deep strikes into Russian occupied territory again.
What is the Storm Shadow? Help me there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I figured that was a topic we were going to dig into today. So the Storm Shadow is a air-launched cruise missile, essentially. It's a weapon that the UK has delivered to Ukraine. It's been integrated on Ukrainian Su-24s, allegedly. So Soviet aircraft getting Western weaponry installed on them. That's not always as straightforward as just putting them on the aircraft they were designed for. But essentially, these missiles have a range potentially upwards of 300 kilometers. There's different versions with different ranges depending on the original versions, export versions, etc. But we can assume that whatever version Ukraine has a range over 300 kilometers, which compared to the HIMARS, if you remember, that sits somewhere around 70 to 80 kilometers in range. So that's a significant increase of reach for those kind of strikes. Also a quite powerful weapon, quite a bit of explosives packed into it, with a capability to even penetrate bunkers, underground targets, and things like that. Not that that's something that occurs that often currently in the conflict with Russia, but it's a capability you have. It's better to have it and not to need it than the other way around, right? So yeah, they've gotten these Storm Shadows very recently. The process of integration is probably going on since last year, but we've seen a couple strikes, especially in the Luhansk area, that do appear to have been conducted with these Storm Shadow missiles, and we're certain to be seeing more of those in the near future. And I think those strikes, which are targeting Russian logistics operations farther away from the front line, those are going to help shape that future offensive. They're going to help degrade Russia's capabilities in fighting off the offensive, if that makes sense.
I have this. You're talking about British missiles on Soviet aircraft, and I'm like thinking of when you have to plug in your laptop charger and you need an adapter when you're going from one country to another country. Is that what this actually looks like? Do you need like the adapter to put the British missile onto the Soviet aircraft, or is it much more complicated than that?
I mean, in a physical sense, yes, there is that element. Like you have to be able to physically attach and detach the missile in its intended manner. And of course, the parts that are created to launch a Storm Shadow aren't created to fit onto an Su-24. So I think that's usually the more, the easier part of integration. That still needs to be developed, tested. Things have to be safe. You don't want to be flying around with missiles that get randomly disattached or don't disattach when they should. A lot of problems can occur. But there's also a level of integration into the avionics of an aircraft, and that depends on how a missile actually interacts with the aircraft. Because in the case of the Storm Shadow, and I think previously we've had a similar example when the HARM missile. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's an anti-radiation missile, so a missile that homes in on radio frequency emissions, so radars. Essentially, that's the main goal. But earlier in the conflict, U.S. HARM missiles were integrated in some former Soviet or former Russian aircraft that Ukraine is flying as well. But the advantage with these kind of missiles is that you can actually set their targets before you take off. So you don't have to set the target from the plane, which means that you can skip some of that direct integration of the computer systems of the aircraft with the missile. So they might not necessarily have to communicate at that level in the air. And sometimes it can be just a mechanical integration where you need to, be able to tell the missile that it is being launched, that it should launch, and then physically release it. So, but I'm not an expert in the exact configurations of these missiles and aircraft, but that's as far as I understand the kind of levels of integration that happen there.
Maybe you're not the expert on this particular thing, but you've forgotten more about this than I'll ever know in my lifetime. And I love this idea of somebody has to go make the converters that you have to use to put British missiles onto Soviet airplanes.
It's big business, actually. If you think about prior to this conflict, the NATO integration of Eastern European countries that were initially all equipped with former Soviet equipment, a lot of times it was a lot cheaper to start to develop ways to fit Western munitions into Soviet weapons than to get new fighter jets or new air defense systems altogether. There's some similar work going on that could help Ukraine as well. For example, modifications that would allow Western anti-aircraft missiles to be fired from S-300 systems, for example. So things like that can massively extend the utility of those systems that Ukraine has but can't get the ammunition for.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's big business, and we'll get to this in a little bit because I want to ask you about the German military aid package that Scholz announced. I guess it was last weekend, because it sounds to me like the German military industrial complex just realized that, we actually have a big opportunity to sell weapons, not just to the revamped German army, but to the Ukrainian army as well. But before we get to sort of that broader stuff, on the Storm Shadows, I'm not a weapons specialist, but I do know that the first step with analyzing weapons and their usage is what are you actually going to use that weapon for? So you talked about destroying bunkers, or they hit targets in Luhansk. What is Ukraine going to use the Storm Shadows for? What is the goal here? Is it take back more territory in eastern Ukraine? Is it push Russia all the way back to the border? Is it we want to take Crimea while we're at it? I mean, where do you sort of I guess the question is, what do you think the goal is for a Ukrainian counteroffensive, and how should we think about what their goals are based on the weapons that they're receiving and asking for?
Well, there's a lot of ways that can go, right? And I think there's two main likely objectives that Ukraine can be playing with, and I've got my own opinion on which is the smarter or more likely one here, but essentially. A lot of people have talked up until a few weeks ago. Actually, it seems to have quieted down now, but a lot of people have been talking about a Ukrainian offensive in the direction of Crimea, with the goal being, to reach Crimea and to get really close to eventually recovering control of Crimea. There are some advantages to an operation like that because you're essentially attacking in a direction that is not currently the center of mass of that Russian military capability that is inside Ukraine. So it might be an easier offensive, but I mean, no offensive is truly easy at this scale, of course. Just want to caveat that. But I think it also raises some questions. So, okay, if you are going to push to Crimea, and that means along the way places like Melitopol, Tokmak, and Enerhodar would be liberated, it would remove that whole land bridge element from the equation. The only connection from Russia into Crimea would be the Kerch bridge, as well as naval transport, and air transport. So really complicating that logistical connection. But then when you sit at the bottleneck on the northern end of Crimea, you're going to face a situation where troops are very concentrated of both sides, and where there's going to be some questions about how well Ukraine might be able to stand up against Russian air power in a situation where they've just positioned themselves much closer to all of those air bases in Crimea, right? Which is something that increases the potential sortie rate by the Russians, etc. So in that kind of an offensive, to kind of hop back to your initial question about the Storm Shadow, how do you use that? How does it fit into these operations? In that kind of an operation, having the Storm Shadow means that you can use that to suppress that air power, artillery, and other kind of operations that Russia might run inside Crimea to target those concentrations of Ukrainian forces around that bottleneck, right? So essentially it means, you can target all of the logistics inside and around Crimea. So you can also target the Kerch Bridge again and try to shut that down. But you can also directly target the airfields. You can target any kind of concentration of Russian forces, headquarters, etc. Make it really difficult for Russia to hang on to Crimea. right? So that's one big idea I think that people are looking at. Now the other one, and personally I think it is on the longer term the more probably the more fruitful one, would be to focus on that eastern front where Russia has gathered that mass of forces around the areas like Bakhmut, but also as far south as Vuhledar, where fighting is still continuing as well, Avdiivka between the two, and then north of Bakhmut, you've still got heavy fighting going on around places like Kreminna, Kupiansk, etc. This is the area where Russia has been focusing that so-called winter offensive. I mean, it hasn't been a very convincing offensive in any part other than the streets of Bakhmut itself. But by focusing an offensive in that direction, the goal would be not necessarily to make this symbolic gain of opening the door to retrieving control over Crimea, but instead the goal would be to destroy that capability that Russia has left. If Ukraine were to be able to take out of the equation all those different units, including Wagner that's fighting there, including the 76th VDV, and including a whole number of forces. The naval infantry has got some allegedly higher quality forces in those areas as well. If you can take those out of action, that increases your probability of success down the line as well, because Russia will be even more limited in which capabilities it can shift around, how it can fight you in other areas. It might make an eventual offensive in the direction of Crimea easier as well, right? Now, and in that kind of offensive, of course, the main goal of using the Storm Shadow or other similar weapons would be to directly assist in destroying that Russian capability. So it takes on a similar shape in targeting logistics, in targeting command structures, maybe even air defense, depending on how tactical they want to go in the use of these kind of weapon systems. But essentially, the use of the system would then be focused on disrupting the specific Russian unit's ability to counter that offensive, rather than making the area of Crimea a living hell.
It sounds to me like you think the latter is what Ukraine is aiming for. Am I reading you right?
I honestly don't know. I've gone back and forth trying to read indicators of where they might be going. Sometimes I was seeing indicators for a while that suggested they might actually be trying to push towards Crimea. I think now more recently seeing those Storm Shadow strikes in Luhansk, that might rise the idea of maybe these are preparations for an offensive in the eastern direction. But if tomorrow we see Storm Shadow strikes in Crimea, that whole indicator gets wiped away again as well. So it's kind of I think obviously Ukraine is going to keep these plans very close at hand. We'll see it when it starts developing, and it's even entirely possible that we might see Ukraine probe in both these directions and decide to commit to whichever one shows the most potential at that time.
Well, that's actually a very reassuring thing you just said, because I was a little concerned, because it seemed like everybody and their mother knew exactly when the Ukrainian counteroffensive was coming, and everybody knew what was going to happen, and that you're reading the tea leaves here and not sure sort of which avenue or which direction the Ukrainian military is going for. I assume the Russians aren't sure either, and Ukraine is trying to make sure that the Russians don't have an idea of where they're actually going to leverage their forces. Before we turn to the Russians, because I want to spend some time talking about the Russians, but I was listening to a War on the Rocks podcast with Michael Kaufman, and one thing that he's been great, since the beginning of this conflict. He got a lot of things right in the beginning that I didn't get right. But one thing he said on that podcast recently that really stayed with me was he sort of talked about how Ukraine has been training all of these units for a counteroffensive, and then Russia has been bringing up conscripts and soldiers and trying to reposition all these other things. And his point was basically just, this is chapter 2 of the war. In some ways, this counteroffensive, we're going to see soldiers on both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side thrown into the battle who haven't fought before. These are fresh troops, troops that really haven't faced each other. So everything we've learned in the past year about these armies, like, yes, you have to keep that in mind, but these are also new armies, and there's going to be new forces to kind of deal with there. And I guess the question that I'm searching for is, well, first of all, do you agree with that framework? And then before we leave the Ukrainian forces, how do you rate the quality and effectiveness of Ukraine's army? It's been over a year that this war has been going. Probably Ukraine's biggest disadvantage is the numbers. They just numerically can't take the kinds of losses and can't pull up the kinds of reserves that Russia can throw into a meat grinder conflict. How do you rate the quality of Ukraine's forces here over a year into the conflict with all this training, all of these weapons that they've gotten? Yeah. What is the quality of the Ukrainian force right now?
First off, let me say, definitely also a fan of a lot of the things that Kaufman has been doing. He's putting some great material out there, and I tend to agree with that assessment of this. We could look at this as kind of a new war with new armies facing each other. I think one of the challenges for each side is going to be managing to just how much of a degree that will be the case. What I mean by that is that as new forces are being trained, you're going to want to transfer all of that institutional knowledge, everything that has been learned before and throughout the conflict, to those new forces. So some of the things that are being done there, for example, is taking troops from existing units and redeploying them in these new units where they are operating together with new recruits and things like that. So the more successful they will be in kind of mitigating that freshness effect of these new units, the more effective they will be on the battlefield, right? And I think I would assume, and maybe that's a little bit of a dangerous assumption, but I would assume that Ukraine, supported by NATO and the training programs where a lot of NATO countries have extensive experience in training foreign forces in a very very intelligent manner. They kind of understand the pitfalls of training these new units, and I think that level of support and the way that Ukraine is tackling this will put them in a better position to field a fresh army that still has a significant amount of institutional knowledge carried over. While when we hear the stories about Russian mobilized forces getting almost no training, if any, even barely able to use the weapon systems that they receive, if they receive any. So those kind of stories make me think that the Russians will not be very effective in bringing that kind of institutional knowledge to the front line. And I recently was told by someone some of the examples of how it seems that in a lot of Russian units, commanders at the levels of colonels and majors, so essentially commanders of companies and battalions and higher up, that those are responsible to actually go down to the tactical level on the front line to tell forces exactly how to take up their positions, how to conduct certain operations, things that normally in a Western army you would have, your junior officer corps, your lieutenants and captains be responsible for, right? So that also kind of tells me that in the Russian army, they have a real problem as they're pushing more and more people in to maintain that level of institutional knowledge, because it seems that most of it tends to exist at the ranks that are not directly engaged in combat at this point.
Well, and this is a good segue, I think, to turn to Russia's forces. So, I mean, while you're talking, I can't help but think about the historical analogies are limited, but I can't help but think about the Korean War, which the Korean War, it's a terrible name for that war. I've said this before on the podcast. It was really, there were two wars there. There was the Korean War, which lasted about 3 months, and then there was the first U.S.-China war. And what China had was just millions of people that could be cannon fodder, and sort of like you said, throwing soldiers in without training them, and some times without weapons, but just so they could get millions of people charging the hill against the United States, which had inferior forces but better technology. It sounds to me like you're describing a situation where Russia has superior force, even if the force is not of particularly good quality. Ukraine has the better technology. And I bring up the Korean War, first US-China war example because that ended in stalemate. The demilitarized zone today is just about where, the demilitarized zone was in 1950 or 1951, whenever the war sort of started. So, Russia's forces, you alluded to this quote unquote counteroffensive. I mean, it's been sort of one mistake after another. And like we've even got these reports of, the guys with Wagner challenging Putin in public and all this dissension within the Russian military ranks here. So, can Russia keep this up? Is Russia in danger of getting beaten back? Or does Russia have the advantage of superior forces and it can just throw people into this meat grinder and is probably betting that it can throw people into it longer than Ukraine can either throw men into the battle or have enough weapons from the West to fight the battle?
So Russia has a tremendous resource in its population that provides it that mass on the battlefield. But I think we need to be very, very clear about how that is not an infinite resource, right? And especially if we're comparing that to historical conflicts, the value of that kind of mass reduces over time because the level of sophistication of warfare goes up, right? So strictly mass translates into less and less advantage on the battlefield. If that mass cannot be trained, if it is not skilled, or even simply able to use basic modern technology like cell phones and applications to control drones and things like that. The more intelligent your mass is, the more trained it is, the more capable it is going to be on a modern battlefield. So I think in that regard, a lot of that mass that Russia has is being negated by the level of skill that is being developed on the Ukrainian and extensively supported by its Western allies, obviously. But, and that kind of leads to your point about, is that a stalemate? Do those two elements lift each other? But what I wonder about is, where does that ability for Russia to keep mobilizing people, to keep pushing that mass into the battlefield, where does that end? Because we know for a fact that it can't be infinite. There is some stretch on Russia's ability to force people to join the military, but at some point the people, and even in Russia, sometimes the people revolt. And when the Kremlin is constantly going to have to be assessing how far they can push things without risking things getting out of control. We also have to keep in mind 2024, we have a presidential election coming up in Russia. Now, I know what everybody listening is shouting at me right now. I understand it's not a real election. Putin's going to win by default and things like that. And that may be true because the Kremlin does control the electoral legislation to a significant degree. Even if they don't commit voter fraud, they're going to select who is allowed to run. So that already kind of makes you win before the ballots open. But the elections are still going to be a very significant reflection of the kind of stability that exists in Russia, the kind of support that the government has, and that is something that will reflect on the position of that government towards the other power brokers in Russia. So when we're talking about the economic elites, the security factions, etc., they are constantly putting their trust in Putin and those around him to run the country in a way that is favorable to them. I think a lot of that trust has been degraded due to the current conflict, but if there start to be real concerns about potential popular dissent and things like that, I think some of those factions might start to withdraw their support from Putin, start to look for ways to get rid of him. And that's where that Russian political system, despite the electoral realities, where that Russian political system can get very, very sensitive. And I think that's something that you were already alluding to when you were talking about Prigozhin sending his his harsh messages to Moscow out on the World Wide Web. It's clear that there is tension between those elites in Russia. It's clear that some kind of conflict is brewing. I think so far it doesn't look like anyone's actually been willing to take up arms and do something about it at that level of Russian politics. But anything that the current government does that could push it further that way is going to be something they're going to think very, very hard about. So all that is to say, just to bring it back to the point I was trying to make, is I don't think Putin has an endless source of mobilization, and at some point he's going to have to say, no, we can't force people out of their homes, recruit them into the military, because people are going to come after me.
Well, I feel like the conventional wisdom has been that the longer the war goes on, the more it favors Russia, because they have those numerical advantages and they can, endure more suffering. I've made that point before with audiences and clients, and also on this podcast before. It sounds to me like it sounds to me though that sort of what you're saying actually would challenge that idea. And this is where I want to bring in, let's get outside of Russia and Ukraine right now, because I thought that 2.7 or 2.8 billion euros, I think it was 3 billion US dollars, military aid package that Germany announced last week. That's basically, the amount of support that Germany's offered in the entire war up to now in sort of one fell swoop. And I mean, what a progression we've seen from Germany. It's been probably too slow for lots of observers, and certainly too slow for the Ukrainian government. But just go back to January 2022, when right before the war started, Germany was sending helmets because they didn't want to send weapons to Ukraine, because they still had this idea that they were going to be able to have Nord Stream 2 and have relations with Russia, but be in NATO and do all these other things. Now we've got Olaf Scholz saying, we don't need anybody to tell us. We need more tanks and more of all these other things. We're going to have German military industrial companies. We're going to start JVs in Ukraine. We're going to start building weapons systems there and all these other sorts of things. That to me sounds like, and Marco Papic, cousin Marco, has been on the podcast a few times. He's talked about how he thought eventually, the Germans would take the natural gas from Russia and the conflict would turn around. And I was always arguing with him. I think things have changed a little bit, but Scholz and the German government always made me doubt myself, because they were so limp-wristed about their support for Ukraine. But it looked to me like that military aid package, that was Germany coming out and saying, hey, we're like, when the defense minister says we're going to do whatever it takes to help Ukraine win this war, I mean, that sounds like it's whatever it takes. And if Germany is committed here, and Germany is going to build Ukraine weapons and supply them with all the technology they're going to need and things like that, that to me says, well, maybe time is actually on the side of the Ukrainians. Maybe as the Russian forces eat themselves alive, it's really Ukraine that can draw this out. And maybe Ukraine doesn't have to do the counteroffensive right now. Maybe Ukraine can just drag this out and get stronger and stronger and stronger and let the Russians sort of tear themselves to pieces. Tell me what you think of that emerging narrative, because I'm trying it on for size. I'm not even sure if I believe that story I just told myself, but how does it sound to you?
No, there's some big thoughts that I definitely agree with. Just to tackle on to what you were saying at the end there in terms of Ukraine being able to stretch out this war and just wait until it gets bigger and bigger, I don't think that's an option, because every weapon system that they wait for is resulting in a number of deaths on the battlefield that they have to accept, because they haven't ended this war yet, right? So I think the capacity, the human capacity that the Ukrainian military has runs out long before they reach that kind of overwhelming force through various different armament schemes from their allies, right? So I don't think that's an option to wait for it. I think to a certain degree, even the current or currently anticipated offensive is going to be a very important marker in just how much support Ukraine can expect to continue to receive from the West. I think people have been putting a lot of resources in there. I mean, you mentioned the example of Germany, which made a tremendous turnaround during this whole conflict. But, the US, the UK, France, Spain, Denmark, even Belgium, Netherlands, everybody is jumping on this. And I forgot to mention a lot of the Eastern European. I need to kind of go through the list to make sure everybody is thanked in order here. But the reality is everybody in NATO and around NATO has really come together to support Ukraine's capabilities. But if that doesn't translate into some kind of success, I think a lot of the political support for the massive amount of resources that goes into that is going to start to withdraw at some point. And I think we talked about that last year as well, which was something that I was really afraid of happening during the winter, for that Western support for Ukraine to start to wither and essentially cause Zelensky to be out there on his own. I think that's still a risk. We'll have to see what happens with all of these current packages of support that are delivered. This offensive is something a long time in the making. There's a lot of effort that has gone into it, not just in terms of material resources, but also training programs, different kinds of integration. It's a really massive test case for everyone to see whether the support can be sufficient to make Ukraine successful, right? So I think we'll have to see it at some point before the winter, because then everything will shut down again. So I don't think they can afford to wait.
Just to stop you there, though, I think the risk is bigger with the United States, and we're seeing that with Biden decided he needed to cancel a meeting of the Quad, so the India, Japan, the United States, Australia. He decided he needed to cancel a Quad meeting of the leaders of the Quad because he had to come home and deal with the debt ceiling negotiations. I think U.S. support is very precarious, but just listen to what we've talked about here. We've talked about this German military aid package. We started off talking about storm shadows from the U.K. I'm sure Macron doesn't want to be left out, so he'll come up with something French that he can claim is better than what both of those sides are coming through. I mean, it sounds like Europe is at least ponying up, and Europe has a lot of capacity. It has to rebuild before it can do that at scale, but maybe it's the best case scenario for Ukraine that as support from the United States might start to wane because of the domestic political cycle in the United States, that European countries are now starting to step up, and they've had a little bit of time to think about this and maybe direct some investment that way. Ultimately in the long term, if Ukraine has any sort of viable path to independence and being rebuilt, it's through the EU. It's not through the United States or anything like that.
Yes, exactly, and that's exactly where I wanted to go. Actually, with the upcoming U.S. elections as well. We talked about Russia having that election in 2024, but the U.S. has one as well. And waning support from Biden might be the most positive outcome Ukraine can hope for, depending on how that election in the U.S. turns out. I think, in the event that Trump gets elected president again, things are looking very poorly for Ukraine. So that's something that they're going to have to be aware of. The fact that US...
Well, actually, no. Hold on. I want to play with that too. Do you think that would be bad for Ukraine? DeSantis, I think, is very clear. He sort of has staked a position as I'm not going to support Ukraine indefinitely, and I care about things like Disney and debt and blah blah blah. Trump, I have no idea to parse what he thinks. I mean, on the one hand, at that town hall, he was like, "Oh, I'll fix it in 24 hours," but at the same time, like Trump hates looking weak. And so he would probably relish the opportunity to quash all the, I'm with Russia and golden showers and this, that, the other thing. No, I'm coming in. I'm going to finish the war. I'm going to really finish. He's a total wild card to me. So I guess from the sense that, Ukraine would have to be worried about the volatility there. But I don't think, like, if I was in Moscow, I don't think I would be sitting there like looking forward to a Trump presidency, because, I mean, God knows what he would do. For all we know, he might go 180 degrees the other direction, and he can, because he's the one in the Republican Party that can say one thing and do another and not get punished for it. So.
No, that's a very fair point. It's not guaranteed which way a Trump presidency would affect the war, but I think that the fact that you have a wild card like that or a loose cannon, let's call it that, the fact that you have a loose cannon in the White House, yeah. That itself is a great source of instability for Ukraine, right? Yeah. So I think without wanting to make a call about which U.S. candidate is better for Ukraine or anything like that, I don't mean to try to send out electoral advice based on the situation in Ukraine there, but the reality is that can shake things up. And the U.S., despite all of the Europeans ponying up as you were saying, the U.S. is still by far the biggest supporter of this entire Ukrainian capability. When you express it in dollar amounts, they are massively larger than anyone else combined. When you're talking about specific weapon systems like the HIMARS munitions, javelins, there's very key technologies that are coming from the US that Ukraine would miss very dearly if they couldn't get their hands on them anymore.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a fair point too. But that also raises, I think, the issue of China. And I know this is a little further afield, but I mean, I don't think the Chinese, correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't seen evidence that China's supporting Russia in a military way. But the Russian economy, such as it is, would not be standing if China wasn't there buying, Russian commodities and, having trade with Russia and things like that. But that's another really disturbing signal, I think, for Russia over the past couple of months. She finally had that phone call with Zelensky. And I think China maybe is looking at the map and say, well, okay, how do we position ourselves if Ukraine does win this war? We don't want to just be stuck in sort of we supported Russia camp in general. And if you get any kind of weakening of sort of, I don't think we can call it support, but if China becomes less ambivalent about the war and more, hey, Russia, you really need to figure this out because we don't want to see state collapse on our borders and you can't win this war. So figure out what you're going to do or we're going to have to make our own decisions. It seems to me like that's another thing that has to weigh considerably on how Russia's thinking about proceeding forward here.
Definitely. And I think that China has been very careful in positioning itself all the way since the beginning of the war. I don't think that China has ever really shown itself to be supporting Russia's military operations in Ukraine. Not materially, but not even politically. Like they have tried to maintain a relationship with Russia. As you mentioned, they have a very strong economical intertwinement. But I think that China is very careful in not putting itself in the same bucket that Russia is in as, being the aggressor, upsetting the international order in this way. And it's a bit odd because at the same time, we are constantly talking about the potential risk of conflict around Taiwan, which would see China do or undertake similar actions as Russia did against Ukraine. But I think we can probably learn something about how China is thinking about situations like Taiwan if we look at how it is positioning itself relative to Russia in this conflict with Ukraine. I'm not a China specialist, but to me, from the little bits and bobs that I get here and there, it seems to me that China is trying to stay out of the role of being a belligerent.
Yeah. I mean, this is we can do a 2-minute tangent on this. Do you actually worry about China attacking Taiwan over, let's say, the next 2 to 3 years? Is that a scenario that worries you? I mean, I'm on record as saying it doesn't worry me at all, and it doesn't worry me at all because I look at China's capabilities and an amphibious assault against a hard target like Taiwan with Japan and the United States and Australia and all these other countries sitting there to support. It doesn't seem to me like China has the capability to even be thinking about that and deluding itself into victory. And until Chinese decision makers and military officials can make the case that no, we stand a very good chance at winning a war like that, it feels to me like that's not going to happen. So it's more like a 7-10 years from now thing for me rather than worrying about it in the next 1 to 3 years. Is that also where you're at, or do you think I need to sort of relook at my assessment of the capabilities of the Chinese military?
I mean, that's the exact reasoning that I had, and I think you were following as well about Russia last 2 years ago, right?
Well, yes, it was, but this gets down to where Putin and individuals matter in geopolitics, because even though Russia didn't, like, you were right, like Russia didn't have the forces to do this. I was right. It was strategically a really, really bad idea. But Putin locked himself in that room with the really long table during COVID-19 and somehow told himself this story that it was good. And he had absolute power in Russia. And he basically said, all right, we're going to do this. And people sort of blindly followed him. China has many virtues. It has many disadvantages. It doesn't seem to me like Xi Jinping has ever shown that kind of capacity for self-delusion. At least he hasn't shown it quite yet. But I take your point that if Xi Jinping locks himself in a room and starts believing that China really could do that, that it would go that way. But that would end in sort of the same way that we're talking about now. Like, it wouldn't end with Chinese conquest of Taiwan. It would end with an embarrassment for China. And I don't think the Chinese Communist Party could last as long as this Russian government has lasted if it was losing a war in trying to reunify with Taiwan.
I think what you raised in the beginning of that response is exactly the thing to be looking for. What is the essential difference in styles of decision making in China and Russia? How much power does Xi really have? How much influence does he really have over this kind of decision making? How much input do military specialists have in that kind of decision making, and how well do they know their job to be able to inform that kind of decision making effectively? If we were to assume that, yes, that is radically different in China than it is in Russia, then yes, I could very easily support a line of thought that says, it's not that likely for China to suddenly go at Taiwan. But again, I don't know that to be the case, so I have to assume that it is at the very least possible.
Yeah. All right, we'll put the tangent aside and let's say sort of last question, get you out of here on this. All right, so it's May 17th, 2023. Describe the battlefield as you think it will be on December 31st, 2023.
Well, that's a very tough one, not knowing where the Ukrainians are going. But let me put it this way. So if let's assume that the Ukrainians are going to focus on eroding that Russian military capacity of those core units around eastern Ukraine, then I would say by December, so we'll be in another kind of winter calm down following an offensive expansion of territories controlled by Ukrainian forces. So I think we might see additional parts of the Russian border secured by Ukrainians at that point. We might see a number of places that were lost over the past year of fighting, like Bakhmut, like Severodonetsk, places like that might be coming back into Ukrainian hands. Possibly we might even see the pressure start to rise on Donetsk itself, the city of Donetsk, because we have a lot of important battlefields that are essentially along the different edges of the city itself, and eventually recapturing the city of Donetsk, which has been in the hands of Russia or pro-Russian separatists since 2014. That to me is perhaps an even bigger challenge than Crimea. So yeah, I think that's where we might end this year, essentially having territory recovered and being in a position where the pressure is being raised towards either those, the city of Donetsk or perhaps Crimea, if that's the direction they go into. But I don't think that we'll see a full recovery of the occupied territories within this year. I think that would require an immense collapse of Russian military capabilities or complete political abandonment of the operation altogether.
Well, and so I hear you on the Ukrainian side. So you're also saying there that you're not expecting, though, a collapse of Russian capabilities over the next 6 to 8 months, even though we are seeing some of that tension brewing within Russia itself.
I think significant attrition on the battlefield, but I don't think that we'll see a full stop to Russia's ability to mobilize within this time frame, within the next few months, essentially, because the forces that will be on the battlefield by December are forces that are being recruited now, right? So I don't think that's going to cause any big shortages, any big changes. The only real big qualitative change that I could see on the Russian side is if the political the political factions completely turn around when it comes to the offensive, if they or the invasion rather, if they decide that they're no longer supporting it, that they're no longer willing to carry the cost of it, that might put things to an end. But I'm also not expecting that to happen so quickly, honestly. I think whatever the Ukrainian offensive causes on the ground is going to take months, if not longer, to reverberate into all of those political decisions.
Yeah. I know I said that was going to be the last question, but one more. Sim, I know you and I usually talk about the Russia-Ukraine war, and that's what I've relied on you here on for the podcast. But you're not just a Russia-Ukraine expert; you're sort of a military expert, security expert in general. There's a civil war in Sudan. Yemen is still sitting there. What is an example of another conflict that listeners maybe are not paying attention to, that they should be paying attention to, that may be crowded out by debt ceiling news or any of these other things? Or is it really just, hey, it's the Russia-Ukraine war, and that's where you should be focused from a security perspective in the world right now?
So I'm actually still very interested in the direction that the security situation across the entire Sahel is evolving. Just to try and keep it brief, not to go into an entire additional hour of discussion, because we could talk about this a lot. We
can definitely have you on for a whole nother episode on that. So how about you tease up the next episode where we just do the Sahel?
That's a great idea. But essentially, between the conflicts in Mali, Nigeria, Central African Republic, and now the civil war in Sudan, and the continuing conflict in Libya, there's a lot of conflicts in that area that have a lot of different, local ethnic elements playing out in them, that have a jihadist element playing out into it. And then it's essentially something where, it's been dealt with in separate operations, separate approaches in different parts of the Sahel, neither of which has been really successful. We've seen over the past year France getting pushed back little by little, being kicked out of countries that are actually aligning a little more towards Russia. So this is all kind of tying into that whole Russia-Ukraine, Russia versus West discussion that we were having earlier, of course. But just to kind of wrap up the idea there, the big question is, will we be able to actually restore some kind of stability there, or is this going to be another perpetual conflict against pockets of extremists in different countries, potential terrorist states rising? I think when the United States was able to finally get out of Afghanistan, out of Iraq to a great degree, the expectation in Europe was that we'd be able to kind of wrap up those operations in the Sahel in a similar way, but it's just not heading that direction.
No, not at all. And as you said, there's a lot there to unpack, and it's getting worse. And this affects markets in ways I think that many observers don't understand. I mean, everything from, Nigeria is a great example. Nigerian oil production continues to dwindle because the Nigerian state just cannot enforce the rule of law and stability on sort of a basic level there. Angola just overtook Nigeria, actually, as Africa's largest oil producing country. Countries like Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, places like this, that you may not have even heard of some of these countries. But if you're thinking about the price of chocolate and when you're buying candy at the store and things like that, this is where your cacao is all coming from. And that all goes back to those farmers. I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal. I didn't know this, but some kind of gum that is crucial in the production.
I was going to mention it, gum Arabic, yeah.
Well, I had no idea. Something like 80% of that comes from Sudan. So apparently, if you're drinking soda out there, maybe you want to stash up on the Coca-Cola products right now. So it may feel like these conflicts are far away, and who cares about a bunch of jihadi rebels in the middle of the desert? But actually, you do. That's what it means to live in a globalized world. But as you said, Sim, let's save that hour for the next time. We'll have you back on soon. And next time you come on, let's not even talk about Russia, Ukraine. We'll do a Sahel and a Yemen check-in and some other I don't want to say fun things because that's macabre even for me. But we'll have you back on and we'll talk about some other hotspots.
But I'd love to. Yeah, thanks.
All right, thanks, Sim. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.